the Wall Street Journal reporting on a possible pay-for-play probe into Trump's inauguration. Federal prosecutors now investigating whether the inaugural committee misspent a portion of the $107 million it raised from donations. Investigators trying to determine if the committee essentially sold access to the incoming Trump administration. Now, the probe being done by the same federal office, the Southern District of New York, that prosecuted Michael Cohen. The Journal reports the investigation partly arises out of materials that were seized in the federal probe of Cohen. Indeed, prosecutors reportedly obtained a recording conversation between Mr. Cohen and Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, a former advisor to Melania Trump, who worked on the inaugural events. Quote, in the recording, Ms. Wolkoff expressed concern about how the inaugural committee was spending money, according to a person familiar with the Cohen investigation. Investigators have also reportedly asked Richard Gates, a former campaign aide who has pleaded guilty to lying in the Mueller probe, about the inaugural committee spending. This new probe going to a long-standing mystery around an early Trump event, the inaugural committee raising nearly twice as much as Barack Obama's, and much of the money never publicly accounted for. My panel on all of this: former Watergate prosecutor Nick Akerman, political science professor Christina Greer, former federal prosecutor Paul Butler, NBC's Ken Dilanian, and joining us by phone, one of the reporters who broke this story, Rebecca Ballhaus of the Wall Street Journal. Rebecca, great to have you with us. Let me begin with you, if I may. Walk us through your reporting in terms of what we exactly learned and what investigators are looking at this moment.
So what we understand is that investigators right now have two prongs to their investigation. The first, as you said, is that they're looking at spending by the inaugural committee, which has disclosed where it spent $61 million of the $103 million it spent, but hasn't disclosed where the other 50 or so million went. And the other side of it is that they're looking at donors who gave to the inauguration and what they might have received in return for those donations.
So how central to the probe are the tapes from Michael Cohen's office that we referenced earlier? Why have they become so critical in this investigation?
So what we understand is that this is partially where the investigation came from. There have been questions about the inauguration fund for a while. We know that Mueller has looked into whether any foreign money went to the inaugural fund. But when FBI agents raided Cohen's home, office, and hotel room in April, they obtained this recorded conversation in which Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, who was the top paid vendor for the inaugural fund, expressed concern about how the inaugural fund was spending its money. And we believe that the investigation has grown somewhat out of that. We know they've also asked other witnesses, such as Rick Gates, who you mentioned, and another inaugural donor, Frank Haney. He's a Tennessee developer who hired Michael Cohen earlier this year. And we understand that they're looking at whether there was some effort to get access through his donation to the inaugural fund.
And Rebecca, really quickly, have you gotten a sense of whether the investigation is focusing on a possible pay-for-play probe, or is this more about the unaccounted funds of the inaugural committee?
It seems to us that they're looking at all areas. As we reported, the investigation is still in its early stages, and we believe that pay-to-play is very much still a part of what they're looking at.
And have we learned any more about what Rick Gates has been able to tell prosecutors or shed light on for these investigators?
We know that he's been asked about both sides of this investigation, so the spending by the inaugural and the donors who gave to the inaugural. He would obviously be in a good place to know. He was the deputy chairman of the inaugural fund, and he also has a cooperation agreement that requires him to answer questions. So if they're looking for a source who would be well placed to answer some of the questions they might have about where this money went and who gave it, Rick Gates is a very good place to start.
And what more have we learned in your reporting about the role of the First Lady Melania Trump's friend, Wolkoff, Rebecca Wolkoff?
So we learned some interesting details about Wolkoff, some of which have been reported previously. So, for example, her company, which was the highest paid vendor by the inaugural fund, it was paid $25.8 million. And it was a company that was formed 45 days before the inauguration. What's the most interesting new detail, I would say, is that Wolkoff and some of her partners were paid about $1.6 million of the $25.8 million that her company was paid. And the remainder went to subcontractors, the source told us. So we don't know who those subcontractors are. By law, the fund is not required to disclose them, but we would expect that this is something that investigators would be very interested in.
All right, Rebecca Ballhaus from the Wall Street Journal. Rebecca, thank you very much. I want to bring in my panel. Now, Nick, let me begin with you. The investigation that is now being led by the Southern District of New York, the same office that led the A, how significant is that? And B, why them as opposed to an office from Washington, D.C.?
Well, I think it's because it comes out of Michael Cohen. It comes out of what they seized in that search warrant in Michael Cohen's office, home, and hotel room. So I think what they're really looking at here is whether or not there is any kind of a quid pro quo for the millions that people were given to donate to the inauguration. Under the fairly recent Supreme Court law, for the government to prosecute somebody for pay to play, they have to actually show that they paid for an official act. That is, they would have to give money to the inauguration with the promise, the quid pro quo, that they would receive some kind of government benefit. So I'm sure that that is what they're looking for. In fact, if I were running the investigation, I would get the names of all the donors, line up the money, and then look in terms of whether their companies or they received any kind of federal funds.
All right, so that, Paul, to that point, is that something that would have had to take time in order to see what was given in exchange for the money? I mean, what kind of charges could have been involved here if we're talking about more than simply access to attending a, celebrity inaugural ball?
Yeah, so we're thinking bribery. As Nick mentioned, it's against the law to receive or pay money in exchange for an official act. The Supreme Court case, McDonald, does make it more difficult for prosecutors to prove, because it turns out there's not a bright line between politicians doing favors for people who are their contributors and what looks more like a bribe. But in addition to just garden variety public corruption, the inaugural committee was a nonprofit. There might be tax violations. There might also be theft. $107 million is a whole lot of money. Where did the money go? Prosecutors follow the money. There might even be reporting errors like there are with regard to the Michael Cohen campaign financing. Because again, like that case, this is also about transparency in our democracy. If all these people are giving millions of dollars to the Trump inauguration committee, we need to know who that is, where the money went, and why the Trump administration seems to be once again covering up.
So, Christina, this, when I think of the list of investigations that President Trump is facing, and I say President Trump and the associates of President Trump, his inaugural committee, Trump Organization, Trump University, this is another front that now the president is embroiled in an investigation into his inaugural committee. What does that say to you?
Well, I mean, for so long he's been Teflon Don, right? I mean, for 40 years that he's been in the public eye, things just haven't seemed to stick to him. And similarly, since he's been president, he didn't have to show his taxes. There's so many things. We have the Access Hollywood tape. Nothing has ever really stuck. The problem is, if we remember there was a conversation that the Mueller investigation would be wrapped up by 2017 Thanksgiving at the final hour.
Right.
And it wasn't. And so we know that Robert Mueller is, as Nick said, slowly but surely putting all the pieces together. Trump University, Trump Organization, Trump Inaugural Committee, Trump as president, because this is a man who's used to grifting and sort of massaging, greasing the wheels. Anyone who lives in New York or New Jersey knows about Trump and the Trump family and how they've conducted business, how they've shorted people consistently for decades on construction projects, how the money has never been straight. And this is something that I think that the president doesn't really think is a big deal. You can sort of see him a little frustrated because it's sort of, this is how he's always behaved. The problem is, this is the federal government, and you're used to lying, and you're used to having people around you lie, and now we see all the people around him in his outer circle and mid-circle, and now his inner circle, and it's getting closer and closer. All of those lies are now coming to catch up to them, and they're actually being held accountable.
Yeah,
pretty soon, the president will have to be held accountable.
Yeah, we're going to delve into a lot more of that inner circle in a moment. But Ken, let me get your thoughts really quickly about the information prosecutors want to get or are getting from Rick Gates, somebody who was at one point part of that inner circle in the Trump world.
Well, Eamon, I covered the Paul Manafort trial, and during that trial, where Rick Gates was a star witness, he testified that he had potentially misspent money from the inaugural committee. I remember that made news at the time, and the Associated Press did a pretty detailed investigation looking at how that committee spent more than twice as much as the Barack Obama inaugural, but had really the same number of parties. So there's always been a question about where did the money go? And then on the fundraising side, there's a number of examples of people who made large donations and then made significant asks to the Trump administration and got policy results. And that seems to be exactly what they're looking at. For example, a coal baron named Robert Murray gave $300,000 to the inaugural committee, according to the New York Times, submitted a list of environmental rollbacks that he wanted, and has basically gotten most of what he'd wanted, according to the New York Times. And that is exactly the kind of things that prosecutors would be looking at.
All right, so Nick, that is a high bar, though. When you're talking about quid pro quo, Ken just gave us a really good example of an individual who donated expecting environmental rollbacks. It seems that at least 2 years into the administration, those rollbacks have gone into effect. Hard to say that it's exactly what he wanted, but how do you then draw a correlation between the money donated, as an investigator and prosecutor, between the money donated and the quid pro quo?
No, you have to prove at the time that there was a quid pro quo, that there was an agreement. It wasn't even an expectation. That it was either a wink, a nod, or something that said, I'm giving you the money, but in return, I'm expecting X, Y, and Z. That's what the government has to prove. It's not just access. Access is not a crime under the new Supreme Court decision, McDonald.
And Eamon, one way the government proves that, what prosecutors do, is they use cooperating witnesses. And so one of those witnesses is Michael Cohen.
Yeah, and you just got to that question I was going to ask you. Go ahead, finish that thought about Michael Cohen. I mean, how important is he now in this investigation?
He's key. So we have this Tennessee developer who gives $1 million to the Trump Inauguration Committee, and then he hires Michael Cohen to help him get a contract for billions of dollars with Trump's energy department. That contract is still pending. They haven't made up their mind, but who has made up his mind is Michael Cohen. He's sentenced to 3 years. If he comes up with other information, was there pay to play, what was the deal, that helps him do less time in prison, and that helps the SDNY learn the truth.
So, Chris, I'm going to give you the final word on this. Anyone who thought the sentencing of Michael Cohen somehow suggested an end to his role in the bigger investigation into the Trump world this evening?
I don't think so. I mean, I always tell my students, I'm like, if you ever get confused about what the answer is, just say money and then work your way backwards, right? Because we also have to remember, it's not just Michael Cohen, the lawyer of Donald Trump. It's Michael Cohen, the deputy finance chair of the RNC, which now implicates some of the members of the Republican Party who have been very quiet and so very supportive of this president. So if Mueller is doing his due diligence, if the SDNY are doing their due diligence, they're not just looking at the individuals who have money, who have possibly been doing pay to play, but also why are certain members of the Republican Party so supportive of this particular president, and what do they know? And so this opens up a much larger conversation about not just the president, but his administration and the larger Republican Party in the past 2 years.
Ken, a final word to you. Where does the investigation go from here? What is your big takeaway after what we learned tonight with this investigation?
This is just another legal thorn in the side, probably not even the most damaging or dangerous one, but in a presidency that is increasingly dominated by and consumed by these various investigations. And it's going to be something that Trump is going to take more and more of the president's time going forward. Legal resources, personnel resources. It's going to bedevil this presidency.
Yeah, a lot of people have been saying this week has put the president under a tremendous amount of pressure. We've seen some of that on Twitter and his reactions. I can only imagine what it's going to be like.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.